Okay, we're going to talk about Ukraine now and the military equipment that's being sent there. But we want to take a moment to mention the recent death of a Canadian citizen. Grigory Semkistrenko was volunteering as a combat medic abroad when he was killed. He was originally from Ukraine, but he spent years living in Saskatchewan and BC. His friends knew him as Greg, and his father told CBC News that he planned to build a house on the water after the war was over. He was 28 years old and is believed to be the third Canadian volunteer killed in the war. And this is the cost. And we don't hear so much about the individual losses anymore because the scope of destruction is just too immense. The latest numbers from the UN's Human Rights Agency on how many civilians have been killed by weapons since the war began has now passed 7,000. The agency says the true total of deaths is likely much higher. But this has been the driving force behind President Zelensky's persistent pleas for the West to send more weapons, specifically tanks. Now, just in the past couple of weeks, his appeals are being met with significant action.
France brings a new level of European defence support to Ukraine, and I thank President Macron for his leadership. We'll get more armoured vehicles, including French-made wheeled tanks. This gives a clear signal to all our other partners.
As President Biden announced yesterday, we are committing 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles with 500 TOW anti-tank missiles and 250,000 rounds of 25mm ammunition.
I can announce the most significant package of combat power to date to accelerate Ukrainian success. This includes a squadron of Challenger 2 tanks with armoured recovery and repair vehicles.
Multiple countries have now pledged or delivered new artillery to Ukraine, from Bradley armored fighting vehicles from the US to Challenger 2 tanks from the UK. This comes after months of debate about whether sending what are considered offensive weapons could potentially escalate the conflict and leave Putin to retaliate against Ukraine's Western allies. So something has really shifted here. To discuss whether this is in fact a turning point in the war and how this new equipment will play out on the ground, I spoke to Rajan Menon. He's the director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. It's a think tank in Washington. He's also an emeritus professor at the City College of New York. So is this a turning point? These tanks and armored vehicles promised?
The U.S., for example, has not committed to sending tanks. There's been discussion about whether it would send the Abrams tank, and it has said no. However, the British are sending their Challenger 2 tanks. They've announced that they would. And then there's a German-made tank called the Leopard that Poland and Finland have. And if Berlin were to sign off on it, they have said that they would send those to Ukraine. Now, what the US and France and Germany have sent are infantry fighting vehicles.
So what's the difference?
So the three in question are the French AMX RC and the US Bradley M2 and a German vehicle called the Marder, M-A-R-D-E-R. These are principally meant to take infantry. The infantry are foot soldiers. They're the only ones who can actually seize and hold land. So you can't do that with a tank, you can't do that with an airplane. But they are vulnerable, these soldiers, obviously, to all kinds of fire. And so infantry fighting vehicles that have armor, but not as much as tanks, take them into the battlefield. These infantry fighting vehicles have enough armor to protect them. All of them have cannons and various other fire mechanisms. Some have anti-tank missiles, like the Bradley has something called the TOW. So they are able to fight tanks to a degree, but they themselves are not tanks. Their principal goal is to deliver infantry to the front.
So these are all offensive instead of defensive weapons, essentially.
Well, it's hard to make a hard and fast distinction between offensive and defensive. So let me give you an example. Let's take a surface-to-air missile, right, that shoots down incoming enemy missiles. Now, most people say, well, that is in a defensive system. But if you have mobile surface-to-air missiles that are accompanying an armored column that's on the attack and protecting it from airstrikes, then of course it's an offensive missile. So if a column is advancing, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and airplanes, and taking the fight to the adversary, then an infantry fighting vehicle can serve in a offensive mode, right? Because it's trying to move ahead. If, on the other hand, the adversary is advancing toward the territory of the country that has infantry fighting vehicles, and the attempt is to try to block that advance, to defend territory, even then infantry fighting vehicles are very useful. So it all depends on how they're used. Now, there is a distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. I'm not saying there is not, but there's sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the two.
So like it can be used as both, essentially,
depending on the circumstances. But
right.
the key thing to bear in mind is that Ukrainian soldiers have run up against artillery fire from Russia, where the ratio has been sometimes 1:20 or 1:10. That is, for each salvo that the Ukrainians release, the Russians release 10 or 20. And artillery is the most deadly way of delivering high explosives at targets. And it has been really, really difficult for the Ukrainians because the Russian style of warfare, which was also the Soviet style of warfare, is to blanket an area with artillery strikes, demolish everything, and then send in your troops because there's nobody there to oppose them. So these vehicles would make the infantry not artillery proof, but they'd give them a much better chance. So imagine that you are sent to a battlefield and you're just advancing, you're running or walking, right? You're a sitting duck for all kinds of things. Now imagine if I put you in a vehicle that has armor to some degree, not like a tank, but also has the capacity to shoot at things that might shoot at you. You have safety even when you dismount and go into combat because it can protect the flanks and protect you to a degree because it's still there.
So do Ukrainian soldiers, do they have the right training ability to use these weapons?
The infantry fighting vehicle training takes some time, but not as long as, say, an air defense missile that the United States has sent. It's a fairly advanced one called a Patriot. The Patriot missile can take months to train. So the infantry fighting vehicles are not in that category. So it all depends on what you're sending. So the IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, are people can be trained up more quickly. Tanks, a little bit more time. But the process of training has generally gone on fairly quickly. And the expectation is not that these systems will be ready to use like next week, but the expectation is that they'll come into the battlefield soon and make a difference. So one of the things that NATO countries like Canada will run up against is that the need, as the war continues, for weaponry by Ukraine will increase significantly. And if those needs are met, then NATO will be drawn further and further into the war. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's the reality.
So what are you going to be watching for then in the weeks and months that come?
You know that since October, the Russians have launched a kind of form of economic warfare by taking aim at the Ukrainian power grid and putting cities in a position where they lack heat, electricity and water.
Work is continuing in Ukraine to restore electricity to thousands of households following Russian missile and drone attacks on Saturday that badly damaged energy infrastructure. One mayor said his city's facilities had been completely destroyed.
A bombardment so fierce, 1 million people lost power at once. This is a grid on the brink of collapse.
30% of the country's power plants have been destroyed. That means in eastern cities like Kyiv-Sharivka, where the destruction is still fresh, residents live without electricity or heat.
I just was texting with a friend of mine in Ukraine and asking her the situation, and she said, electricity is touch and go, heat is touch and go, water comes on and off. And so we have to see what the effect of that is, whether it will destroy Ukrainian morale, as Russia expects. My sense from having just visited there, I've been there twice during the war, is that it's had the opposite effect. It's actually made the Ukrainians much angrier and determined to persist.
After these latest drone attacks, he said it's clear Russia hopes to exhaust Ukraine. They will fail, he said.
But we also need to ask the question, if they keep hitting the grid and affecting things like water supply and sewage systems, will there be public health hazards in large cities that necessitate evacuation? That hasn't happened yet, but at least one mayor, the mayor of Kiev, Valery Klitschko, a former boxer, he said that we may have to do that. That would be a huge catastrophe. So that's what I'm watching for. And then, of course, what kind of weapons will the West provide? What is the debate that will occur? There's a meeting, I think it's ongoing or coming up very soon in Ramstein in Germany, where the NATO panjandrums will get together and figure out what to do next. So the West is kind of caught in, on the one hand, supporting Ukraine, on the other hand, not wanting to escalate the conflict. And escalation can take place in two ways. One, Russia uses nuclear weapons, and the other is horizontal escalation. That is, the war spills over into NATO territory, and that becomes a real problem.
Yeah, it's a fine balance to watch, for sure. Okay, well, we will be watching for all of that. Rajan Menon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be with you.